Silence is your only mercy, Omega. The Alpha King's voice didn't just command the room, it froze the very air. Vaelor Grimhowl stood like a monolith of scarred muscle and dark fur, his hand gripping a length of enchanted white silk that shimmered with a predatory light. Before him, Calithea Nocturne felt the phantom ache of the fated mate bond, a golden thread in her soul that was currently being shredded by the man who was supposed to protect it. Around them, the great hall of Nightvale was a sea of judgmental eyes and hushed whispers, the court elite watching the public dismantling of a woman they considered a curse. The Siren's weaver blood is a rot in our lineage, Vaelor growled, his amber eyes burning with a mixture of distrust and a buried, agonizing attraction he refused to acknowledge. He stepped into her personal space, his towering frame casting a shadow that swallowed her whole. You believe your voice is a gift. I see it as a dagger aimed at the throat of my kingdom. You will not weave your melodies here. You will not seduce my warriors or whisper dissent into the wind. Calithea tried to speak, her lips parting to tell him that her song was the only thing keeping the encroaching frost of the northern wastes at bay, but Vaelor was faster. His large, calloused hands that should have been used to pull her into a protective embrace, reached for her face. He wound the silk tight over her mouth, the fabric tasting of cold iron and ancient magic. The enchantment snapped shut like a trap, magically tethering her jaw, stealing the vibration of her vocal cords. The physical pain was nothing compared to the spiritual hollow that followed. Vaelor leaned down, his rugged bearded face inches from hers, the scent of pine and old blood radiating from his furs. I, Vaelor Grimhowl, Alpha King of the Iron Peaks, reject you, Calithea Nocturne. I reject the bond, I reject your weaver's tongue, and I reject the destiny the moon attempted to thrust upon me. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. To reject a fated mate was an act of supreme arrogance, a defiance of the divine. Calithea's pale blue eyes shimmered with unshed tears, her vision blurring as the bond between them turned to ash. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they grazed the dark leather of his bracers, a silent plea for him to see the truth behind her eyes. He didn't flinch. He grabbed her wrist, his grip firm but strangely devoid of the heat she had felt in her dreams. With a sharp tug, he forced her to her knees in the center of the cold stone floor. From this moment you are the Silent Ward. You will walk these halls as a ghost, a reminder to all that no magic is greater than the Alpha's will. He turned his back on her, the heavy sweep of his black fur cloak hitting her shoulder like a physical blow. As he ascended his throne, Duke Iskarn Blackthorn watched from the periphery, a thin viper-like smile touching his lips. Calithea sat in the dirt of the court's judgment, her dignity torn away, her voice locked behind a shroud of silk, while the man who had just sentenced her to a living death remained blissfully unaware that he had just discarded his only shield against the shadow rising in his own house. Please subscribe to this channel if you are hooked in for more stories like this every day. Thank you. Now let's dive in. Chapter 1. The feast that followed the rejection was not a celebration of union, but a funeral for a bond that had never been allowed to breathe. The great hall of Nightvale was a cavern of flickering torchlight and the heavy metallic scent of roasted meat and spilled ale. At the high table, Alpha King Vaelor Grimhowl sat like a god of war carved from the very obsidian of the mountains he ruled. His red hair, vibrant as a dying sun, clashed against the dark, oppressive furs of his mantle. He drank deeply, his jaw set in a permanent snarl, as if the very act of existing in the same room as his rejected mate was an affront to his sovereignty. Calithea Nocturne stood in the shadows of the periphery, a ghost in a gown of midnight emerald. The silk shackle across her mouth felt like a brand of hot iron, the magical dampening of the cloth vibrating against her skin whenever she tried to draw a breath to hum. To the court she was the Silent Ward, a cursed thing kept as a trophy of Vaelor's dominance over the old ways. To herself she was a vessel of music being slowly suffocated by silence. Her pale blue eyes tracked every movement in the hall, her heightened weaver senses picking up the jagged, discordant rhythms of the people around her. The air in the room was wrong. It didn't carry the usual chaotic harmony of a rowdy pack feast. Instead it felt oily, sliding over her skin like a serpent through wet grass. From the far end of the hall, Duke Iskarn Blackthorn detached himself from a group of sycophants. He moved with a predatory grace that lacked the honest brutality of a wolf. He was all shadow and silk, his eyes hooded and unreadable. In his hands he carried a chalice of hammered silver, the stem encrusted with rubies that looked like droplets of fresh blood. Calithea felt the shift before she saw it. As a siren's weaver, she didn't just hear sound. She felt the molecular vibration of the world. Every substance had a frequency, a song of its own. Wine usually hummed with the lazy, sweet resonance of fermented sun and earth. But as Iskarn approached the king, the air around the chalice began to scream. It was a high-pitched dissonant note, a jagged edge of sound that set Calithea's teeth on edge. It was the frequency of rot, the vibration of a substance designed to unravel the tapestry of life itself. Nightshad's kiss. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat that Vaelor should have heard through their bond, had he not severed it with such callous efficiency. She stepped forward out of the shadows, her hands reaching instinctively for her throat, for the voice that was no longer hers to use. "My king," Iskarn purred, his voice a smooth baritone that masked the venom beneath. He bowed low, the silver chalice held out like a holy offering. "To celebrate your strength. To the purity of the bloodline, cleansed of the siren's taint. This vintage comes from the southern Valas, aged in the dark for a century. Only a throat as ironclad as yours could appreciate its depth." Vaelor's gaze flicked to the Duke, then momentarily to Calithea. His eyes narrowed, seeing her distress but interpreting it as feminine weakness or a desperate play for attention. He felt the pull of her presence, a phantom itch at the back of his mind, and he hated her for it. He hated that even silenced and shamed she could make his pulse quicken. Calithea lunged forward, her slippers skidding on the stone floor. She tried to cry out, to scream a warning that the wine didn't sing of grapes in summer, but of stilled hearts and paralyzed lungs. All that emerged was a muffled, pathetic whimper against the enchanted silk. "Get back, Omega," Rook Ironvale, the Shadow Guard, whispered as he stepped into her path. His hand was on the hilt of his blade, his expression a mask of duty, though his eyes held a flicker of curiosity at her frantic state. "The king has no words for you tonight." Calithea grabbed Rook's forearm, her fingers digging into his leather bracers. She shook her head violently, pointing toward the chalice. She tried to project the sound in her mind, the screeching, dissonant frequency of the poison, hoping that some vestige of their shared pack nature would allow him to sense the danger. But Rook was a soldier, not a seer. He saw only a distraught woman reaching for a king who had already cast her aside. Vaelor's hand closed around the silver stem of the chalice. The rubies seemed to glow, reflecting the firelight like the eyes of a waiting predator. "Your loyalty is noted, Iskarn," Vaelor said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. He lifted the cup, the liquid inside a deep, viscous crimson. "No." Calithea's mind screamed. She threw herself past Rook, ignoring the guard's startled shout. She reached for the table, her hand outspread to knock the silver vessel from the king's hand. She didn't care if he struck her. She didn't care if he threw her into the deepest dungeon in Nightvale. She only cared that the melody of his life, a dark, powerful rhythm she had loved since she was a child, was about to be cut short by a silent, jagged chord of death. Vaelor's reaction was instantaneous. He didn't see a savior. He saw a defiant pet breaking her leash. He stood, his chair clattering back against the stone, and caught her wrist in midair. His grip was bone-crushing, his anger a physical heat that radiated off his skin. "You dare?" he hissed, his face inches from hers. The scent of the wine was close now, and Calithea could smell the bitter almond and the metallic tang of the neurotoxin. It was a cold scent, like a grave opened in midwinter. "You would touch the king's cup? You would seek to spill a gift offered in my honor." He pushed her back, her small frame stumbling into the heavy oak table. The court went silent, the only sound the crackle of the hearth and the heavy breathing of the alpha. "See how the siren hungers for control," Iskarn remarked softly to the gathered lords, his voice carrying perfectly through the quiet. "Even silenced, she seeks to disrupt the king's peace. Perhaps the silk is not enough. Perhaps the tongue itself is the problem." Vaelor looked at the chalice, then back at Calithea. To prove his point, to show her that her fears and her presence meant nothing to his iron will, he raised the cup to his lips. He stared directly into her eyes that were wide with a terror he mistook for madness. "I am the king of the Iron Peaks," Vaelor declared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "No poison of the spirit or the flesh can touch what the mountain has forged." He tilted his head back and drank. Calithea watched in slow motion as the liquid disappeared behind his teeth. She felt the moment the first drop touched his tongue. The harmony of his body, the steady, thrumming bass of his heart, stuttered. A sharp, discordant note rang out in her mind, a sound like a violin string snapping under too much tension. The Duke's smile didn't widen, but his eyes grew bright with a terrible, patient hunger. Vaelor set the cup down with a heavy thud. For a heartbeat he looked triumphant, his amber eyes mocking her silence. Then the mock changed to confusion. A tremor so fine it was almost invisible started at the tips of his fingers. The silver chalice began to rattle against the wood of the table. Calithea slumped against the wall, her strength failing her. She had tried to weave a warning out of thin air, but the world was deaf to a woman without a voice. As Vaelor's hand went to his throat, his breath hitching in a way that sounded like the beginning of a death rattle, she realized the true cruelty of her position. She was the only one who could hear the king dying, and she was the only one whose song could possibly save him. If only the man she loved would let her speak. The great hall began to blur as the toxin took hold of the king's nervous system. Vaelor gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white, then a sickly grayish blue. He tried to speak, but his vocal cords, usually so vibrant and commanding, were the first to surrender to the Nightshade's kiss. He looked toward Iskarn, then toward Rook, and finally his gaze landed on Calithea. In that final moment of consciousness, as the paralysis crept toward his heart, Vaelor Grimhowl didn't look like an alpha. He looked like a man drowning in a sea of his own making, finally realizing that the anchor he had cast away was the only thing that could have kept him afloat. Calithea tore at the silk over her mouth, her fingernails drawing blood from her own cheeks, but the magic held fast. The serpent had struck, the king had fallen, and the silence of the night was just beginning. Chapter 2. The silence that followed the king's final draft was not the peaceful quiet of a satisfied court. It was the suffocating stillness that precedes a landslide. Vaelor Grimhowl stood at the head of the table, his hand still clamped around the silver stem of the chalice, but his knuckles were no longer the flush of a living man. They were turning a dull chalky gray, the color of the very shale that made up the foundation of the Iron Peaks. Calithea watched, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, as the discordant scream in her mind, the frequency of the Nightshade's kiss, reached a fever pitch. Vaelor tried to draw a breath, but the sound that left his throat was a dry, rattling scrape, like stones grinding together in the belly of a glacier. His amber eyes, usually burning with a predatory fire, suddenly flickered with a terrifying realization. He looked down at his own hand, watching as the gray hue crept up his wrist, hardening the skin into a rigid, crystalline texture. It wasn't just paralysis. It was a literal petrification of the spirit, a toxin designed to turn the Alpha's legendary strength into his own tomb. The chalice slipped from his nerveless fingers, hitting the stone floor with a hollow ring that seemed to echo for an eternity. The remaining wine splashed against his boots, the deep crimson liquid looking like fresh blood against the rapidly graying leather of his footwear. Vaelor reached out, his arm moving with the agonizing slowness of a rusted hinge, reaching for the throat of Duke Iskarn Blackthorn. But his muscles refused to obey. The calcification had already claimed his elbow, locking his arm in a grotesque half-extended reach. "Pie King." Rook Ironvale's voice broke the spell of the room, sharp and laden with a soldier's instinct. He stepped toward the dais, his hand hovering over the hilt of his blade. "Vaelor, what is this?" The Alpha King couldn't answer. His jaw was the next to surrender. The supple skin of his neck hardened, the tendons standing out like cords of granite. A low, guttural groan vibrated in his chest, a sound Calithea felt in the soles of her feet. It was a dying melody, a bass note being crushed under the weight of a mountain. She lunged forward, her hands clawing at the silk across her mouth until her fingertips bled, but the enchantment held. She was a witness to his extinction, bound by the very cruelty he had used to silence her. Then the collapse happened. Vaelor's knees didn't buckle, they shattered against the floor like pillars of salt. The sound of his body hitting the stone was heavy, resonant, and entirely wrong. There was no soft thud of flesh, only the jarring clatter of something mineral. He lay on his side, his magnificent red hair spilling across the gray-stained floor, his eyes wide and fixed on Calithea. In those fading embers of his gaze, there was no longer rejection. There was only a primal, wordless terror. "Poison." Rook's roar shattered the frozen atmosphere of the hall. The king has been struck. Lock the doors. No one leaves this hall. The great hall erupted into a chaotic symphony of violence and fear. Benches were overturned, women screamed, and the high-ranking lords scrambled away from the dais as if the king's condition were contagious. Duke Iskarn, however, did not move. He stood perfectly still, a shadow against the flickering torchlight, his face a mask of practiced concern that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Look at him," Iskarn said, his voice slicing through the din with a terrifying clarity. He pointed a long, pale finger at Vaelor's prone form. "The Alpha's blood has turned to silt. This is no mere venom. This is the work of a weaver. This is the Siren's curse made manifest." The accusation hit the room like a physical blow. 100 pairs of eyes turned toward Calithea, who stood trembling by the wall, the blood from her torn fingertips staining the white silk over her mouth. She shook her head, her pale blue eyes pleading with them to understand. She was the only one who knew the truth. She could hear the Duke's pulse, a steady rhythmic thrum of triumph that betrayed his guilt, but she had no way to weave the evidence into the air. Rook Ironveil knelt beside the king, his hands hovering over Vaelor's chest. "He's cold," Rook whispered, his voice cracking with a rare display of emotion. "He's turning to stone, Iskarn. His heart is still beating, but I can hear it struggling against his ribs. It sounds like a hammer on an anvil." "Then we must act," Iskarn declared, stepping forward with the authority of a man who had already won. "The ward must be taken to the pits. Clearly, her presence has invited this rot into our sanctuary. If the king dies, she follows him to the pyre." Calithea felt the heavy hands of 2 guards seize her shoulders. She didn't struggle, she couldn't. Her entire being was focused on the vibration coming from Vaelor. Even as his skin took on the jagged, unyielding texture of a mountain peak, she could hear the tiny, flickering spark of his life force deep within the stone. It was a faint, high-pitched hum, a song of survival that was being slowly drowned out by the Duke's dissonance. As the guards dragged her toward the heavy oak doors, she looked back one last time. Vaelor was almost entirely gray now, a statue of a fallen god in the center of a ruined feast. The Nightshade's kiss had claimed his voice, his movement, and his crown. The Alpha King was a prisoner in his own body, and as the doors of the great hall slammed shut, leaving her in the cold darkness of the corridor, Calithea realized that the silence he had forced upon her was now the only thing keeping them both from salvation. The poison was not just killing him, it was rewriting him. And unless she could find a way to shatter the silk and sing the stone back into flesh, the kingdom of Nightvale would wake up to find its king nothing more than a monument to his own hubris. Chapter 3. The dungeon of Nightvale was a place where sound went to die, a subterranean labyrinth carved into the roots of the mountain where the air tasted of damp salt and ancient, forgotten sorrows. Calithea sat in the corner of her cell, her back pressed against the weeping stone. The enchanted silk still clung to her face, a ghostly reminder of Vaelor's cruelty, but it felt heavier now, saturated with the humidity of the pits. Every breath she took was a struggle, filtered through the magical weave that continued to dampen the very essence of her soul. In the absolute darkness, her other senses expanded. She could feel the rhythmic dripping of water 3 levels down. She could sense the scurrying of vermin in the walls. But most of all, she felt the discord. Far above her, through layers of granite and iron, the palace was vibrating with a frantic, jagged energy. The king's life force was a fading pulse, a dull thud against the encroaching silence of the stone. It was a dying metronome, slowing with every passing second as the calcification reached for his vital organs. The heavy iron door at the end of the corridor groaned on its hinges. Calithea didn't move. She expected the executioner or perhaps the Duke's men coming to finish what the poison had started. Instead, the footsteps that approached were measured, heavy, and lacked the oily slink of Iskarn's lackeys. A single torch flickered to life, its orange glow bleeding through the bars of her cell. Rook Ironveil stood there, his shadow stretching long and distorted against the wall. The shadow guard looked as though he hadn't slept in years. His armor was scuffed, and his face was tight with a mixture of grief and a burgeoning, dangerous suspicion. He didn't speak at first. He simply watched her, this small, silenced woman who had tried to knock a cup from a king's hand. "The healers have given up," Rook said, his voice a low rasp that barely carried over the damp air. They brought in the alchemists from the southern border. They tried to chisel at the stone on his chest to give his lungs room to expand, but the blades snapped like glass. Vaelor is becoming a statue, Calithea. By dawn he will be a monument and the Duke will be the regent. Calithea stood, her emerald gown torn and stained with the grime of the floor. She stepped toward the bars, her eyes burning with an intensity that made the hardened soldier flinch. She grabbed the iron rods, her bloody fingertips leaving smears on the cold metal. She began to hum, not a song for the silk prevented that, but a vibration. It was a low, resonant frequency that mimicked the sound of the king's struggling heart. Rook frowned, leaning closer. What is that? That sound, it's the same rhythm I heard when I put my ear to his chest. Calithea nodded frantically. She closed her eyes and shifted the vibration, moving from the heart to the sound of the poison, the screeching, dissonant edge she had felt in the wine. She made the air in the small cell shimmer with the sheer force of her intent. Even through the magical dampener of the silk, the sound was unmistakable to someone as attuned to the palace's secrets as Rook. It was the sound of a discordant weaver, a pattern being unraveled. Rook's eyes widened. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the bars. You didn't poison him. You were trying to harmonize the toxin. You were trying to counter it. He looked around the dark corridor, his hand going to the ring of keys at his belt. I saw Iskarn's face when the king drank. He wasn't surprised. He was satisfied. And you, the woman Vaelor shamed, you're the only one who looks like your soul is being torn apart. The lock clicked. A sharp, decisive sound that felt like the first note of a new movement. Rook swung the door open and grabbed Calithea's arm, but not with the roughness of a guard. He held her with the desperation of a man who realized he had been guarding the wrong prisoner. I can't remove the silk, Rook whispered, his voice urgent as he led her toward a hidden servant's passage behind a tapestry of the first alpha. The enchantment is tied to Vaelor's own life force. It's a king's knot. Only he can undo it or his death will make it permanent. But if you can do whatever it is you were doing in that cell, if you can reach him through the stone, I will give you the chance. They moved through the shadows of the palace like twin ghosts. The halls were strangely empty. Most of the court had retreated to their chambers in fear, or were already drinking to the new regime in the Duke's wing. The air grew colder as they approached the royal bedchamber. The scent of incense and medicinal herbs was thick, an attempt to mask the smell of the drying, mineralized skin of the alpha. At the door to the king's chambers, two of Rook's most trusted men stood guard. They stepped aside without a word, their loyalty to Rook outweighing their fear of the Siren. Inside the room was a tomb. Vaelor lay on the massive furs of his bed, but he no longer looked like a man. He was a sculpture of agony. The gray stone had climbed past his neck, encasing his jaw and cheeks in a jagged crystalline mask. Only his eyes remained uncovered, amber orbs frozen in a state of eternal, silent screaming. His chest barely moved, the calcified skin making every breath a titanic struggle against the weight of the mountain. Calithea rushed to his side, her knees hitting the floor with a dull thud. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the cold, gray stone of his cheek. The vibration coming from him was almost gone. The melody was fading into a flat, silent line. Rook stood by the door, his sword drawn, his eyes scanning the shadows. Do it, Calithea. Whatever you are, whatever curse they say you carry, use it. Save him, or we all turn to stone under Iskarn's rule. Calithea leaned her forehead against Vaelor's stone chest. She ignored the silk biting into her face. She ignored the coldness of his skin. She reached deep into the core of her being, finding the forbidden song that lived in her marrow. She couldn't sing with her mouth, but she could sing with her soul. She began to vibrate her entire body, sending a pulse of pure, resonant harmony directly into the king's calcified heart, searching for the crack in the stone where his life still hid. The room began to hum, the very glass in the windows vibrating in sympathy with the rejected Omega's silent plea. Chapter 4. The royal bedchamber was an altar of silence, the air thick with the smell of guttering tallow and the metallic dry scent of parched earth. Vaelor lay encased in his own skin, a monument to a living death. The gray calcification had reached his cheekbones, leaving only the amber pools of his eyes exposed, flickering embers in a cooling hearth. Calithea knelt beside the bed, her emerald skirts pooling on the floor like a patch of moss on a barren cliffside. She felt Rook's presence at the door, a heavy, watchful weight, but her world had narrowed to the man of stone before her. She pressed her palms against his chest. The furs beneath him felt warm, but Vaelor himself was as cold as a mountain peak in midwinter. There was no rise and fall of his ribs, no rustle of breath. To any other observer he was a corpse carved from granite, but Calithea's weaver senses told a different story. Deep beneath the layers of mineralized flesh she felt a microscopic tremor, a rhythmic stutter so faint it was less a heartbeat and more an echo of a ghost. The Nightshade's kiss was a masterwork of discord. It didn't just stop the heart, it changed the frequency of the blood, turning the fluid of life into a jagged crystalline sludge that the body could no longer recognize. To heal him she couldn't just offer medicine, she had to offer a counterfrequency. She had to weave a song that would vibrate the crystals of the poison back into liquid, shattering the stone from the inside out. But the silk shackle was still there, a cruel white bar across her lips. It was a physical and magical barrier designed to stifle her power, yet it was tied to Vaelor's life force. As he faded, the silk grew tighter, as if the king's dying will was determined to take her voice with him into the dark. Calithea closed her eyes, bowing her head until her forehead rested against the cold stone of his sternum. She didn't try to force a sound through her throat. Instead she began to hum from the center of her chest, a low, guttural vibration that bypassed her vocal cords and traveled through her bones. It was a sound born of the marrow, a primal resonance that she had been taught to fear as a child, the heart song that the Weaver cult used to bend the world to their whim. At first the room remained still. The only sound was the crackle of the hearth and the distant, muffled shouting of guards in the courtyard below. But then a soft, crystalline ring filled the air. It was a sound like a wet finger circling the rim of a glass, high and haunting. It was the sound of the poison reacting to her. Calithea pushed harder. She poured every ounce of her grief, her rejection, and her lingering, stubborn love for the man who had broken her into that single, steady vibration. She felt the resonance travel through her palms and into the king's body. She was looking for the key note, the specific frequency of Vaelor's soul that would act as a bridge. Suddenly she found it. Deep in the center of the calcification she felt a spark. It was a deep, resonant bass note, the sound of a drum echoing in a deep cavern. It was Vaelor's true nature, the alpha's roar, buried under the Duke's silence. Thump. The sound was so sudden it felt like a physical blow. Calithea's hands jumped back as the stone of Vaelor's chest surged beneath her. Thump thump. The heart that had been silent for hours gave a violent, spasmodic heave. It was a ragged, desperate beat, but it was there. The vibration she had sent into him had acted like a hammer, cracking the first layer of the internal paralysis. From the doorway, Rook let out a choked sound of disbelief. He stepped closer, his hand gripping the hilt of his sword so hard his knuckles turned white. I saw it. His chest moved. Calithea, his heart is beating. She didn't look up. Her vision was swimming, the effort of maintaining the internal song drawing the very heat from her blood. She felt the silk shackle pulse with a malevolent light, trying to choke out the vibration, but she wouldn't yield. She realized then, with a clarity that cut through her exhaustion, that her voice wasn't a weapon of destruction as Vaelor had feared. It was the only antidote in existence for a poison that sought to turn the living world into a graveyard. As she continued to hum, a thin hairline fracture appeared in the stone just over Vaelor's heart. A tiny bead of crimson blood, real liquid blood, well up from the crack, a single drop of life marring the gray perfection of the petrification. Vaelor's amber eyes suddenly snapped toward her. The pupils dilated, reflecting the emerald of her dress and the frantic hope in her gaze. He couldn't speak, he couldn't move his limbs, but in that moment of shared vibration the bond, the frayed, rejected golden thread between them, hummed with a sudden, violent electricity. He felt her. For the first time in his life the Alpha King wasn't just looking at the Omega. He was hearing her. He felt the warmth of her song melting the ice in his veins. He felt the agony of his own body returning to him, 1,000 needles of fire as the blood forced its way into the calcified capillaries. And most of all he felt the crushing weight of his own mistake. He had silenced the only melody that could keep him alive. Calithea felt his awareness flare, and the shock of it nearly broke her concentration. The vibration wavered, and the king's heartbeat immediately began to slow, the gray stone threatening to knit itself back together over the crack. "Don't stop." Rook urged, his voice a frantic whisper. Whatever you're doing, keep the rhythm. The Duke's men are coming up the spiral stair. I can hear the clatter of their plate. You have to bring him back further, Calithea. Bring the king back to us. She leaned back in, her hands gripping Vaelor's stone shoulders. She abandoned the low hum and began to project the sound through her teeth, a sharp, buzzing resonance that made the teeth of everyone in the room ache. She was no longer just healing, she was fighting. She was at war with the Duke's poison and the king's pride. The first note had been struck. The silence had been shattered. But as the sound of boots echoed in the hallway outside, Calithea knew that a single heartbeat wouldn't be enough to save him from the grave, or the betrayal that was even now knocking at the door. Chapter 5. The resonance in the room had reached a shattering pitch, a frequency so high and pure that the fine crystal carafes on the king's sideboard exploded into 1,000 shimmering shards. Calithea was a conduit of raw, vibrating intent, her body trembling with the effort of channeling the heart song through the magical dampener of the silk. She saw the gray stone on Vaelor's neck begin to flake away, revealing the flushed, feverish skin beneath. The Alpha was coming back to the world of the living, his pulse a frantic rhythmic drum against her palms. But as the king's life flared, the shadows in the hallway deepened, and the discordant scream of the Duke's presence returned, louder and more jagged than before. The heavy oak doors of the royal bedchamber didn't just open, they were kicked inward with the force of a battering ram. Rook Ironvale was instantly a blur of steel, his blade clearing its scabbard with a hiss that cut through Calithea's humming. But the men who poured into the room weren't just the palace guard. They were the Duke's personal black-clad enforcers, their faces hidden behind iron visors. And leading them, his silk cloak billowing like a shroud, was Duke Iskarn Blackthorn. Iskarn didn't look like a man surprised by a miraculous recovery. He looked like a gardener coming to pull a stubborn weed. His eyes swept over the scene, the shattered glass, the bleeding Omega, and the king whose stone mask was slowly dissolving. A flicker of genuine irritation crossed his features, quickly replaced by a mask of horrified outrage. Treachery! Iskarn's voice boomed, projecting into the hallway to ensure the gathering servants and lesser lords heard every word. I suspected the Siren had a hidden hand in this rot, but to find her here at the king's bedside finishing her dark work? Guards, seize the assassin. Rook stepped in front of Calithea, his sword leveled at the Duke's throat. She isn't killing him, Iskarn. She's the only reason his heart is still beating. Look at his skin, the stone is receding. She is the cure. The Duke let out a cold, mocking laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering over a tombstone. The cure? Look at her iron veil. She is vibrating with the very same dark magic that petrified our Alpha. She isn't healing him, she is molding him. She is turning our king into a puppet of the Siren cult, weaving her voice into his marrow while he is too weak to resist. Can you not hear the screeching in the air? It is the sound of a soul being unmade. Calithea tried to stand, her legs turning to water. She reached for the silk at her mouth, her fingers desperate to show the world the blood she had shed to save Vaelor, but the Duke's men were already upon them. 2 guards lunged at Rook, forcing the shadow guard into a desperate dance of parries and ripostes. He was one of the finest blades in the Iron Peaks, but he was outnumbered and hemmed in by the furniture of the royal suite. Get away from him, witch! Iskarn snarled, stepping toward the bed. He reached into the folds of his cloak and pulled out a small ornate vial filled with a shimmering black liquid, the concentrated essence of the Nightshade's kiss. I will not have the king's corpse desecrated by your melodies. Calithea threw herself over Vaelor's body, her small frame a shield against the Duke. She looked down at the king. His amber eyes were wide, darting between the Duke and the woman who had spent the last hour vibrating his heart back to life. He was conscious now, but the paralysis still held his tongue and his limbs. He was a spectator to his own assassination. She saw the flicker of recognition in his gaze, the moment he realized that the Siren was the only thing standing between him and the Duke's final dose of death. See how she clings to him? Iskarn shouted to the guards entering the room. She drinks his life like a parasite. Rook Ironvale, you have been blinded by her seduction. Step aside, or you will hang beside her on the pyre. Rook took a shoulder check from a guard, his back hitting the stone wall. The only person hanging will be you, Blackthorn. I saw the chalice. I smelled the rot on your hands. But the narrative had already been set. The Duke had spent years cultivating the court's fear of the Weavers, and the sight of Calithea Nocturne hovering over a petrified king was all the evidence the frightened soldiers needed. One of the guards swung the butt of his halberd, catching Calithea across the temple. The world exploded into a burst of white stars. She felt herself sliding off the bed, the connection to Vaelor's heartbeat snapping like a violin string. As she collapsed onto the floor, the silence returned, a heavy, oppressive vacuum that seemed to suck the very air from the room. Without her vibration, the gray stone on Vaelor's chest began to creep forward once more, the cracks she had fought so hard to open knitting shut with a sickening, stony crackle. Iskarn stood over her, his boot pressing down on her emerald gown. He leaned down, his voice a whisper that only she could hear. "You were a fool to think a voice could stop a kingdom from changing hands, little bird. I will burn your tongue out before the sun sets, and I will carve my name into the stone of your king's heart." He looked up at his men, his face once again a portrait of grief. "Take the assassin to the high tower. She is to be executed at dawn for the murder of the Alpha King. And as for Rook Ironvale, strip him of his rank. He has been corrupted by the Siren's song." Calithea felt the guards dragging her away, her head lolling against her shoulder. Through the haze of her concussion, she saw Iskarn approach the bed with the black vial. He wasn't going to hide it anymore. He was going to finish the petrification in front of everyone, claiming it was a mercy to end the king's suffering. She looked at Vaelor one last time. A single tear escaped his amber eye, trailing down the gray stone of his cheek before freezing into a tiny crystalline bead. He had rejected her voice, and now, as the Duke tipped the black liquid toward his lips, the Alpha King was finally learning that some silences were eternal. The heavy doors slammed shut, and for the first time in her life, Calithea didn't try to hum. She didn't try to fight the silk. She let the darkness take her, knowing that the only man who could speak the truth was now a statue in his own tomb, and she was the ghost destined to burn for his silence. Chapter 6. The high tower of Nightvale was a finger of cold basalt reaching into a sky that had turned the color of a bruised plum. Inside the cell, the air was thin and bitingly cold, smelling of old snow and the iron tang of Calithea's own blood. She leaned her head against the narrow slit of the window, watching the torches of the Duke's patrols flicker like malevolent fireflies in the courtyard far below. The concussion from the guard's blow throbbed in time with her heartbeat, a dull rhythmic ache that reminded her she was still tethered to a world that wanted her dead. She reached up, her fingers grazing the silk shackle. It felt tighter now, the magic woven into the fabric sensing her desperation and feeding upon it. It wasn't just a gag, it was a leech draining the resonance from her throat. She tried to push a vibration into the stone wall, a silent call for help, but the silk hummed with a counterspell that numbed her nerves. A sharp, metallic scrape sounded from the heavy iron door. Calithea pulled back, her eyes wide, expecting the Duke's executioner. Instead, the door swung open to reveal a shadow within a shadow. Rook Ironvale stepped into the moonlight, his armor gone, replaced by a dark, travel-worn cloak of heavy wool. His face was a map of fresh cuts, and his left arm hung slightly stiff at his side, but his eyes were clear, sharpened by the clarity of a man who had lost everything but his honor. "Don't make a sound," Rook whispered, then winced at the absurdity of his own words. He moved quickly to her side, his hands steady as he checked the chains on her wrists. "The Duke has declared himself Lord Protector. He's telling the court that Vaelor's heart has completely turned to stone. He's planning a coronation of transition by noon tomorrow." Calithea grabbed Rook's tunic, her eyes burning with a question. "He's still alive," Rook answered the unspoken plea, his voice dropping to a low, urgent rasp. "But barely." The Duke added more of that filth to his veins. "But the first note you struck, it did something, Calithea. A small part of his chest, no bigger than a coin, is still warm. It's a stubborn spark, but it won't last another night in that damp tomb of a bedroom." He pulled a small curved dagger from his belt and began to work at the manacles. "I have horses at the postern gate. We can't fight our way back into the royal chambers, not yet. Iskarn has the entire Shadow Guard under his thumb, claiming I'm a traitor. But there is a legend in the old scrolls of the Iron Peaks. They speak of the frostbloom echo, an herb that grows only in the lungs of the world, where the wind hums through the glacial caves. The weavers used it to amplify their voices until they could shatter mountains." Calithea felt a jolt of recognition. She had heard the stories in the nursery of the Siren cult, a flower that drank the resonance of the earth. If she could find it, she wouldn't need to struggle against the silk. Her voice would become a force of nature that no enchantment could suppress. The peaks are a 3-day journey for a healthy man, Rook said, finally snapping the iron around her wrists. We have to do it in one. The storm is coming and it's the only cover we have. They descended the tower not through the stairs, but through the treacherous exterior scaffolding of the masons. The wind howled around them, trying to tear Calithea from the wooden planks, but Rook's hand was a constant, grounding force. He led her through the lightless guts of the palace, through sewer grates that smelled of rot, until they emerged into the biting air of the stables. 2 mountain horses, shaggy-coated and barrel-chested, waited in the gloom. Rook hoisted Calithea onto the smaller of the two, a gray mare with intelligent, fearful eyes. "Ride like the great wolf is at your heels," he commanded, swinging himself onto his own mount. They burst out of the postern gate just as the alarm bells began to toll, a frantic, discordant bronze clanging that tore through the night. Arrows hissed through the air like angry hornets, one thudding into the wood of the gate inches from Calithea's leg. She didn't look back. She leaned low over the mare's neck, her fingers buried in the coarse mane, and let out a silent internal scream that drove the horse faster into the maw of the mountains. The ascent was a blur of vertical shadows and freezing mist. As they climbed higher, the air grew so cold it felt like inhaling needles. The trees thinned out, replaced by jagged ribs of rock that seemed to groan under the weight of the sky. Calithea could feel the mountain vibrating beneath the hooves of the horses, a deep tectonic bass that hummed in her teeth. This was the source of the weaver's power, the raw resonance of the world's bones. By the time they reached the high passes, the horses were lathered in frozen sweat, their breath coming in ragged plumes. Rook pulled his mount to a halt at the mouth of a shimmering blue ice cave. The wind here didn't just blow, it sang. The geological formations acted as natural flutes, creating a haunting, polyphonic melody that made Calithea's blood dance. "The lungs of the world," Rook breathed, his face pale with exhaustion. He dismounted and helped Calithea down. Her legs buckled, the thin air making her head spin. "The scrolls say the frost bloom grows where the music of the mountain is loudest." Calithea staggered into the cave, drawn by a sound only she could truly perceive. Deep within the ice, where the walls were translucent as fine silk, she saw it. A single crystalline flower, its petals as clear as diamond, vibrating with a light that pulsed in time with the earth's core. It didn't just grow, it resonated. She reached for it, her fingers trembling. This was her only chance. To save the king who had silenced her, she would have to consume the very thing that would make her voice a weapon. As her hand closed around the frozen stem, she felt a sudden violent connection to Vaelor through the bond. Far below, in the dark palace, his heart gave a final, desperate leap. The Duke was standing over him with the blade. Calithea didn't hesitate. She crushed the frost bloom against her chest, feeling the icy essence of the plant seep into her skin, into her throat and into her soul. The vibration within her expanded, a tidal wave of sound that threatened to tear her apart from the inside. She looked at Rook, her eyes glowing with a terrifying ethereal light. The flight was over. The hunt had begun. Chapter 7. The world of flesh and bone had long since dissolved into a landscape of unyielding gray. Vaelor Grimhowl was no longer a king, nor a wolf, nor a man. He was a consciousness trapped in a cage of minerals, a spark of heat buried beneath a mountain of ice. The Nightshade's kiss had completed its physical conquest, turning his lungs into bellows of slate and his heart into a jagged obsidian knot. But as his physical senses failed, as the smell of the Duke's oily perfume and the flickering light of the bedchamber vanished, his soul was cast into the in-between, the liminal space where the fated bond resides, stripped of the distractions of the material world. It was a realm of infinite twilight, a vast echoing expanse that mirrored the jagged peaks of his kingdom, yet everything here was translucent, shimmering with the silver-blue light of the moon. Vaelor stood on a precipice of his own making, his spectral hands looking down at the tattered remains of the golden thread that had once connected him to his mate. He had shredded it with his own pride, hacked at it with his distrust of the weaver blood, and yet in this place of truth, the thread did not look dead. It looked like a cauterized wound, pulsing with a rhythmic golden light that he finally recognized as Calithea's life force. In the in-between there was no silk shackle. There was no silence. Suddenly the silence of the twilight was shattered. It wasn't a sound he heard with ears, but a vibration that resonated through the marrow of his spiritual form. It was the heart song Calithea had channeled into his chest back in the royal chambers, but here, it was stripped of its mystery. It was a wave of pure, unadulterated emotion that hit him like a physical blow. "I'm not your enemy, Vaelor." The thought wasn't a whisper. It was a roar of clarity that shook the foundations of his spectral mountain. He saw her then, not as the fragile emerald-clad girl he had humiliated, but as a towering pillar of light and resonance. In this psychic bridge her thoughts were laid bare, spilling into his consciousness like a river bursting its banks. He saw her childhood not as a training ground for sirens and assassins, but as a lonely struggle to contain a power that terrified her. He felt the agony of her first transformation, where the music in her blood had almost shattered her ribs because she had no one to teach her how to sing it. He felt the moment she had first seen him at the Great Gathering, not with a hunger for his crown, but with a soul-deep recognition that made her entire world finally fall into harmony. "You silenced me because you feared the truth of the bond," her voice echoing with the resonance of the frost bloom she had just consumed in the physical world. "You chose the safety of the stone over the vulnerability of the song." Vaelor fell to his knees in the silver dust of the in-between. The weight of his hubris felt heavier than the petrification of his body. He saw the memory of the feast from her eyes. He felt the cold, oily discord of Duke Iskarn's soul as the man approached with the chalice. He felt her desperate, frantic need to save him. A need that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with a love that survived even his rejection. He felt the bite of the silk against her mouth as he tightened it, and for the first time he felt the spiritual suffocation he had inflicted upon her. Every time he had demanded her silence, he had been cutting out his own heart. "I didn't know," he tried to howl, his spectral voice sounding like the cracking of a glacier. "Calithea, I didn't see." "Because you were looking for a monster," the resonance replied, gentler now, though tinged with the icy bite of the mountain wind. "You looked for the Siren of the legends, never the woman who was made for you." Through the bond he felt a sudden surge of new energy. It was sharp, cold, and ancient. The frost bloom. He felt Calithea's spirit expanding, her resonance growing so powerful it began to bleed through the veil of the in-between and back into his petrified flesh. The gray world around him began to shake. The silver peaks of his fever dreams started to crack, and through the fissures he could hear the real world again. The sound of Duke Iskarn's voice, distant and distorted, like a serpent hissing through a wall of glass. "The king is gone," he heard Iskarn say in the waking world. "Prepare the shroud. The stone has claimed his heart." In the in-between Vaelor stood up, his amber eyes blazing with a fury that transcended death. He reached out and grabbed the frayed, golden thread of the bond. He didn't just hold it, he wove his own soul into it, anchoring himself to Calithea's resonance. He felt her pain, her exhaustion, and the terrifying power of the herb she had consumed. She was a storm coming for the palace, a melody that would either heal the kingdom or bring the mountains down upon it. "Calithea," he whispered, the name finally tasting like wine and wood smoke on his tongue. "Sing. Shatter the stone. I am listening." The twilight of the in-between began to dissolve into a blinding white light. The paralysis of his spirit was breaking, fueled by the realization that he had rejected the only person who truly knew the song of his soul. As the final barrier between the dream and the reality shattered, Vaelor Grimhowl prepared to wake up in a body of stone, waiting for the first note of the woman he had tried to erase to set him free. The bond was no longer a thread. It was a bridge of fire. And as he felt Calithea's presence nearing the palace gates, the Alpha King's heart gave a single massive and defiant beat that echoed like a war drum through the halls of Nightvale. Chapter 8. The gates of Nightvale did not open for Calithea Nocturne. They shattered. The storm she had brought down from the peaks was not composed of wind and snow alone, but of a resonant frequency so pure it acted like a physical siege engine. Beside her, Rook Ironvale rode like a man possessed, his blade a silver arc in the moonlight, but even he stared in awe at the woman beside him. Calithea was no longer the trembling Omega in a stained gown. Her eyes glowed with the bioluminescent frost of the herb she had consumed, and her skin shimmered with a pale ethereal light. Around her, the air distorted, warping the torchlight of the palace guards into jagged halos of refracted color. As they reached the courtyard, Duke Iskarn's black-clad enforcers swarmed like ants from a disturbed hill. They raised their crossbows, but before a single bolt could fly, Calithea reached for the silk shackle at her mouth. She didn't fumble with the knot. She didn't wait for Vaelor to release her. She gripped the enchanted fabric with fingers that hummed with the power of the frost bloom and tore. The silk did not just rip. It disintegrated into a cloud of white sparks, the magic within it unable to contain the tidal wave of sound surging up from her lungs. She opened her mouth, and for the first time in her life she didn't hold back. The first note was a low, tectonic rumble that shook the foundation of the palace. It was the sound of the mountain waking up, a bass frequency that made the shields of the guards vibrate until they fell from their numbed hands. The Duke appeared on the high balcony, his face contorted in a mask of absolute terror. He raised the black vial, screaming for his men to strike, but his voice was swallowed by the sheer volume of Calithea's resonance. She began to sing. It was not a song of words but a weaver's tapestry of sound. She wove the memory of the wind in the pines, the heat of a fated bond, and the jagged, painful reality of her rejection into a melody that was both a weapon and a prayer. As she stepped toward the royal wing, every window in the great hall exploded outward in a rain of glittering diamonds. The guards fell to their knees, clenching their ears as the sound bypassed their armor and resonated directly in their bones. She moved through the halls like a vengeful goddess of music. Each step she took sent a ripple of sound through the floorboards, shattering the Duke's influence. When she reached the king's chambers, she found Iskarn standing over Vaelor's stone body, his dagger pressed against the gray, mineralized throat of the Alpha. "One more note, Siren, and I carve his head from his shoulders." Iskarn shrieked, his eyes bloodshot with desperation. Calithea didn't stop. She looked at Vaelor, at the amber eyes that were now wide and focused on her, reflecting the light of her song. She reached for the highest note a weaver could attain, the shattering chord. It was a sound that didn't just vibrate, it unmade. She directed the focus of her voice not at the Duke but at the king. The sound hit the room like a physical explosion. Iskarn was thrown back against the wall, the dagger flying from his hand as the air itself became too dense to breathe. The stone casing around Vaelor began to glow with a brilliant, white-hot intensity. Calithea poured everything into the note. Her lungs burned, her throat felt as though it were being shredded by glass, and her heart beat in a frantic, syncopated rhythm with the frost bloom's power. A sound like a thunderclap echoed through the chamber. A massive fissure appeared on Vaelor's chest, following the line of the small warm spot she had nurtured hours before. Then another. And another. The gray calcification didn't just fall off. It disintegrated into fine, harmless dust. Calithea pushed the note higher, her voice spiraling into a celestial frequency that resonated with the very molecules of the nightshade poison. The black toxin, sensing its end, tried to retreat, but the song followed it, chasing the rot out of his capillaries, out of his marrow and out of his soul. Vaelor's body arched off the bed, a primal roar finally erupting from his throat, a roar that harmonized with her song. The gray faded from his skin, replaced by the flush of life and the heat of an alpha's fury. The stone mask on his face shattered into 1,000 pieces, revealing the man beneath, his amber eyes now burning with a fire that was no longer clouded by distrust. As the final note died away, the silence that followed was not the heavy, oppressive quiet of the tomb, but the breathless peace of a storm's end. Calithea slumped forward, her strength spent, the frost bloom's light fading from her eyes. She felt a pair of massive, warm and distinctly human arms catch her before she hit the floor. Vaelor gripped her against his chest, his heart thudding like a war drum, steady, strong and entirely his own. He looked up at the Duke, who was gasping for air on the floor, and then down at the woman who had sacrificed her silence to give him back his life. "You," Vaelor whispered, his voice raw and shaking with 1,000 unspoken apologies. The poison was gone. The stone was dust. And as the Alpha King held his mate in the ruin of his chambers, the only sound left in Nightvale was the rhythm of two hearts finally beating in time. Chapter 9. The dust of the shattered petrification hung in the air like a silver veil, shimmering in the dawn light that filtered through the broken windows. The royal bedchamber, once a silent tomb, was now a theater of reckoning. Duke Iskarn Blackthorn scrambled backward on the floor, his fine silk robes torn and coated in the grey grit of his failed coup. He reached for a hidden blade in his boot, his face twisted in the ugly, frantic desperation of a cornered rat, but he was no longer facing a statue. He was facing a king who had been forged anew in the fire of a siren's song. Vaelor Grimhowl moved with a fluid, terrifying speed that the stone had only served to sharpen. He didn't use a weapon. He didn't need one. He stepped across the room, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and seized the Duke by the throat. The sound of Vaelor's grip tightening was the only noise in the room, a stark, brutal contrast to the celestial melody that had just saved him. He lifted the traitor off the ground, his amber eyes glowing with a predatory clarity that made Iskarn's courage vanish into a whimper. "You sought to turn me to stone." Vaelor's voice was a low, cavernous growl vibrating with the residual power of Calithea's resonance. "But you forgot that the mountain does not fear the cold. It only waits for the sun." With a flick of his wrist, Vaelor hurled the Duke toward the doorway. Rook Ironvale, bloodied but standing tall, stepped from the shadows to meet him. Without needing a command, Rook and his remaining loyalists seized the Duke, binding him in the very iron chains he had intended for the Omega. As they dragged the screaming traitor toward the deepest pits of the fortress, the oppressive weight that had hung over Nightvale for weeks seemed to lift, replaced by the crisp, biting purity of the morning air. Vaelor stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving. He was the Alpha King once more, but the arrogance that had defined his reign was gone, replaced by a profound, trembling stillness. He turned slowly toward Calithea. She sat on the edge of the bed, her body frail and swaying, her emerald gown a tattered ruin. Her throat was bruised, her lips were swollen from the force of the shattering cord, and her eyes, those pale, beautiful blue eyes, were fixed on him with a mixture of exhaustion and a lingering, heartbreaking hope. The king did not speak. He did not issue a decree or call for his court. Instead, he did something that the history of the Iron Peaks had never recorded. He crossed the room and sank to his knees. The heavy thud of his knees hitting the stone floor echoed louder than any roar. He bowed his head, his large, calloused hands resting palm up on his thighs, a gesture of absolute submission. The man who had demanded her silence, who had bound her mouth in silk and rejected her soul, was now kneeling in the dust of his own hubris. "I have walked through the dark," Vaelor whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of his shame. "I have felt the cold of the grave, and in that silence I finally heard you. I heard every word you never said. I felt every prayer you hummed into my skin while I was too blind to see you." He reached out, his fingers trembling as they hovered near her hands. He didn't touch her. He waited, granting her the agency he had stolen. "I told you that your voice was a dagger. I was wrong. It was the only light I had, and I tried to blow it out. Calithea, I do not ask for your crown. I do not ask for your duty. I ask for your forgiveness." Calithea looked down at him, her heart thudding against her ribs. The frost bloom's fire had faded, leaving her cold and hollowed out, but as she looked at the Alpha King, her mate, she felt the golden thread of the bond begin to knit itself back together. It wasn't the jagged, forced connection of the past, but a soft, shimmering bridge of mutual understanding. She reached out and placed her small, scarred hand over his. She didn't hum. She didn't sing. She took a breath, the air clear of silk and magic, and spoke the first words she had uttered in years. Her voice was raspy, a low and melodic rasp that sounded like water flowing over smooth stones. "Look at me, Vaelor." He lifted his head, his eyes searching hers. "The silence is over," she said, her voice growing stronger, a small smile touching her bruised lips. "I did not save a king. I saved my mate. And if you want my words, you must learn to listen to the ones that are not spoken." Vaelor leaned forward, pressing his forehead against hers, a sob of relief catching in his throat. In that moment, the kingdom of Nightvale was reborn. It would no longer be a land of iron and silence, but a kingdom of song and resonance. The Siren's weaver would sit not as a ward, but as a queen, and the Alpha King would never again fear the music of the heart. As the sun rose fully over the peaks, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose, the people of the palace gathered in the courtyard. They didn't hear a command for execution or a call to war. Instead, they heard a new sound drifting from the royal balcony, a harmony of two voices, one a deep bass and the other a soaring soprano, weaving a story of a rejection that had turned into a resurrection. The Iron Peaks had a new melody, and for the first time in an age the mountains sang back. Thank you for listening to this story. Please tell me in the comments section where you are watching from, like, share and subscribe to this channel for more stories like this every day. God bless you as you do.